Today we are going to talk rings, and we're going to be using Halstead's new ring making kit, which is a kit that comes with all of the supplies you need to make 5 rings, and it's also going to give you an introduction into tube setting as well as prong setting. So it's a great introduction to rings as well as to working some stones into your ring designs. So the materials that it comes with are some 12 gauge half round wire for our chunkier ring bands, some 18 gauge round wire for our more delicate ones, a pre-made ring shank from Halstead, as well as tube settings, prong settings, and some clear CZs. The tools that we are going to need today are pretty varied. We're definitely going to need a ring mandrel for sizing and shaping our rings, a rawhide mallet for that shaping and forming. We're going to need some things for cleanup like files, sandpaper, or rotary tools, which are great for cleanup and finishing. We're going to need our soldering tools, so a soldering surface, some tweezers, cross-locking tweezers and a third arm are super helpful for this, a solder pick, our preferred flux, etc. And then we're also going to need our setting tools. So that can be a chasing hammer and a setting punch, or you can use specific tube setting punches that are a great option and keep things pretty quick and speedy. Also helpful, especially for the prongs, are a pair of chain or flat nose pliers, just in case we need to tweak those prongs a little bit if our stone doesn't sit perfectly. So there are 2 ways that you can add your settings to your rings. The kind of introduction and easiest way is to solder your setting right on top of the ring band, which is a great option, especially if you're making stacking rings, because then their setting's not in the way and they all butt up against each other. Or you can set that setting down into the ring, so it's a little bit of a lower profile, and that kind of ring band comes around and meets the sides of the setting. So the first one that we're going to do together is soldering that setting on top of our band. And I'm going to use that pre-made ring that came in the kit, and I'm going to use one of the prong settings to demo that. The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the bottom of my setting is nice and flat. So that may mean I just need to give a little bit of a file to it if there's any markings from how they're made. I've got my ring and I've got my setting. And with this size ring and this size setting, I don't need to do a ton of work to either one of them. But if you're working with larger settings or larger rings, you may want to file a curve into the setting with a half round file, or a little bit of a flat spot onto your ring band, just to make sure that the connection point is really good. But I found with this setting, which is for a 4mm CZ, anything 4 millimeters and underneath, I typically don't need to, because it's just not big enough to really affect that connection point. So I'm working with a honeycomb block and my prong setting, and I like to put my settings upside down. So my honeycomb block might not be the best option because it's got holes in it. So I'm just going to set those aside and use this solderite board instead, which is a little bit flatter. Before I set up, I want to flux all of my pieces. And I only need to flux one part of the ring where that setting is going to go. The nice thing about using these pre-made rings from Halstead is they are cast, so there is no seam to them. So when you're working with them, it's really great. You don't have to worry about where that seam is and whether or not you're going to reflow it. If you are using a ring that you created yourself, you're going to want to make sure to put the seam opposite the setting to keep it as far away as possible. So I'm going to pop my setting upside down on my board, and I'm going to grab my ring in a pair of cross-locking tweezers, and I'm just going to place it on top of the setting with a little bit of tension. So now that it's kind of set up, I want to make sure it's nice and even. Especially with the prong settings, you want to make sure that each individual prong is oriented evenly in relationship to your ring band. So that might mean having some prongs in line with the ring band, or it might mean having the ring band go in between prongs. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to make sure that my ring band is sitting right in the middle of the bottom of my setting. So I'm going to take a look at it from the top, from the sides, all around to make sure that's even and tweak it if necessary. All right, so I've got that pretty good and even. Definitely spend time on your setup. The more time you spend on your setup getting it right, the easier the soldering will be. I'm going to make sure to cut plenty of solder chips for this piece, using that hard solder again, and I can use hard solder for this entire piece. I'm going to use about the same size torch tip, and when I come in here, I'm going to place a piece of solder on either side of that setting. So we've got a round setting and our ring comes across. So where that ring intersects that setting on either side, I'm going to put a little ball of solder on each side. So torch is lit up. I'm going to scoop up my first ball of solder. I like to be prepared and always have one in my hand before I start. And I'm going to gently heat the whole ring. We're going to work the same way, wait for our flux to get clear and glassy before we place those solder chips. Going to come in and place the first one. And just be mindful of those prongs. They're pretty thin, so we want to make sure that we don't overheat them. I'm coming in and placing my other ball of solder, so I've got them on either side. And now I'm going to heat the whole thing a little bit more and then focus in and make sure to get those solder balls to flow between the ring and the setting. Our ring is probably going to take a little bit more heat, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the ring than the setting just because it's a little bit larger. So it'll take a little bit longer to come up to temperature. I'm focusing in now. And there my solder has flowed. And we'll pickle this, and then I'll show you how to set the stone. All right, so we've pulled our prong setting out from the pickle, and now is when I like to just take a look at it and double check to make sure my setting is even, which it is. It looks great. Our ring shank goes right between those two prongs and those two prongs, so it's nice and regular. And now is the time where I would clean this ring up however I wanted to. If I wanted to give it a satin finish or a high polish, I would do that right now. But we're just gonna go ahead and set the stone. I've got 4mm clear CZs from Halstead. They come in a bunch of different colors though, so this is a fun way to add a pop of color to your jewelry. And I've got my prong setting. The nice thing about my prong setting is that my seat is already cut, which is great. The first thing I'm going to do is test fit my stone. And I want to make sure to have a pair of chain nose pliers on hand just in case I need to tweak my setting a little bit. Something that can come in handy while you're doing this is a wax stick. So this is just some sticky wax on a toothpick, but it's helpful because I can pick up my stone with it, and especially if you're working with anything smaller than 4mm, sometimes it's a little tough to grab them with your fingers. So I'm just gonna pick it up and plop it into my setting and just move it around with my fingers if I need to. And what I'm looking for is I want to make sure it's sitting nice and level. And this is where you would open up any prongs if the stone doesn't fit. Sometimes you might want to close them up a little bit if it's like wiggling around in there a little too much right now, because right now we just want to get it in there and see where it's sitting. So I'm going to hold that up and look at it from all directions and make sure that my stone is sitting level. So the first thing I'm going to do is use my pliers and squeeze all of the prongs right at the girdle. And what that's doing is it's just tightening it up. So I'm just going to give them all a gentle squeeze to make sure that all my prongs are coming in contact with my stone. And I'll want to make sure to do one more double check before I push the top of those prongs over. And it looks good. And I also want to take a look from the top too, and if I need to move any of those prongs closer together or farther apart, just so the spacing between each prong is even, I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And these are really like micro adjustments. You don't want to squeeze too hard, because you don't want to move things too much. Usually it just requires just a little bit. And now I'm ready to set the stones. And that part is super easy. I'm just going to use one of my bezel pushers. You might already have one of these for cabochon setting or something like that. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to work north, south, east, west, work in opposites. And I'm going to take that prong and I'm going to push it over the top of my stone. So the way that the angle of my setting tool is going is it's kind of going from a 45-degree angle to a 90-degree angle or upright. So I'm just kind of taking that prong and going whoop and pushing it right over the top. So now that I've done one, I want to make sure to go and set the prong that is opposite of that one. And I'm just pushing it down. And now I can move to the next one, push it down, find the prong opposite of that one, and do the same thing. And working in opposites helps keep that stone evenly set. You're putting tension on it in opposites, which is going to help keep it level. And we're going to come in and push down our last prong. And that's a set stone. That is all it takes with these pre-made prong settings, and it is super fast and easy. Now though that we're all set, I do want to just take 1 minute to kind of give it a quick overlook And I just want to make sure to look at each prong and make sure it is pressed all the way down onto my stone. I don't want any gaps between the prong and the stone. So that may mean I need to come in and give it another push or something like that, but you just want to double check that. Any gap means that prong could easily get caught and open up, which we do not want. And that looks great. So once you've got that set, a fun little thing that I like to do is I just like to hit it with some sort of polishing agent, whether it's a rubber wheel or hit it real quick with a polishing cloth, just to make sure that the top of those prongs are super shiny is a really nice way to finish these guys off. So we've got our ring with our setting on top, all completed, stone set, ready to go, and we'll do the tube setting next together. The first thing that we need to do is figure out how long we need to cut our material for the desired size ring that we want. Today I'm going to be making a size 7 ring. So I'm going to pull out my chart from Halstead. That is my ring making material guide. So I'm going to come down here on the ring size area and come down to a size 7. And I'm going to work across to the size material that I'm using, which is 18 gauge. And that tells me that I need to cut my material to 57.2 millimeters long. And once that's brought around, I will have a size 7 ring. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that one end of my wire is nice and flat. And I can do that by first giving it a trim with the flat side of a pair of snips, or I can just take a file and make sure to file that nice and flat. And I'm going to get my ruler with the millimeter side and measure that out to 57.2, but I'm going to come to the 57 and make my mark right there. And using either a saw or the flat side of your snips, I'm just going to snip right after that mark that I did. And then I'm going to file down a little bit so that I make sure to get the correct size. All right, and now what we need to do is we need to form this ring. And we are going to use our ring mandrel and our rawhide mallet to do that. And the rawhide mallet is a great option because that hammer face is not going to mark up or deform our metal at all. It's just going to shape it. All right, so I've got my ring mandrel and my bench has some holes drilled into it. So I'm just gonna put the tip of that ring mandrel in the hole, and I'm gonna take my wire and my rawhide mallet. And the first thing I'm gonna do is I wanna make sure to curve around the very ends of my wire because those are going to be the trickiest to bring around. So I'm gonna make sure to do that first. I'm gonna hold the end of my wire, and right now I'm holding this at about a 4. I'm working much smaller than my final ring size because right now I'm not worried about it being perfectly round. I just want to make sure that those ends meet up nice and perfectly. So I've got my end on the ring mandrel and I'm just going to hammer that around. And I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other end. And now that I've got both of those started to be brought around, I can make sure to bring the rest of my ring around. All right, so the ends are overlapping a little bit, and I'm just gonna do all of the rest of my finishing with my fingers. All right. So I'm just kind of brushing those ends back and forth. I'm going to take a look and kind of bend them, make sure they're nice and even. I also want to make sure to take a look at my seam and make sure that there's no gaps there. And one of the great ways to do this is to hold it up to a light source and see if I can see any light coming through that seam. And we are pretty good. I'm not super worried that it's not perfectly round or it's not perfectly flat right now. We will do all of that finessing after we solder it. I'm going to flux up the seam of my ring. And I like to just lay this part flat on my solder board. And our kit also comes with some hard solder in wire form. However, if you have medium or easy solder and prefer those, you can absolutely use those instead. I'm going to use my snips and just cut a bunch of little chips onto my solder board here. And I want to make sure to cut a couple extra just in case, because they do like to wander away sometimes. So I'm just cutting super tiny chips and giving myself a couple extra. And I'm going to light up my torch. And I'm working with a fairly small flame here because we're just using 18 gauge wire, which isn't that thick, so it's not gonna take a ton of heat to bring this up to soldering temperature. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to gently heat the entire ring. I will scoop up a piece of solder and place it on my seam, and then I'm going to focus in on that seam. I want to make sure that my flux goes clear and glassy before I place that solder on. That clear and glassy finish means that my solder is going to stick right to that surface, which is what we want. Alright, so I'm going to gently heat up my whole ring, and this whole thing's going to go pretty fast. My flux is clear and glassy. Focus in, heat it, and my solder has already flowed. Super fast when we're working with 18 gauge material like this. I'm going to quench and pickle this, and then we will form it into a nice perfectly round ring. Alright, so we've pulled our ring out of the pickle. We're just going to take a look at that seam, make sure it's soldered all the way. This is now when we would want to clean that seam up if it's a little uneven or we've got a little bit of a solder blob. So using a file, our sandpaper sticks, any of our rotary tools to do that. Just give it a quick cleanup. We really do want to take off any of that excess solder right now, because when we go to make sure that it's nice and perfectly round, we don't want to hammer that solder into the ring. So we want to make sure to take it off. So I'm going to slide that ring onto my mandrel, and I'm just going to tap it out with the rawhide mallet all the way around. And I want to make sure to always keep sliding that ring down the mandrel to keep it nice and tight. What I'm looking for is when I look at that ring on the ring mandrel, I don't want to see any gaps between the mandrel and the ring, and that's how I know that it's perfectly round. So I've rounded it out that way, but when I look at it this way from the top, it is a little wonky and it is not flat, which is totally okay. You can use a steel block if you've got one, or if you've got just like a piece of hard wood, your bench top, anything super hard is going to serve the same purpose. I'm gonna pop that ring flat and use my rawhide mallet to tap it out. And I'm just looking to make sure that it sits flat on that surface. After I do that, I can always just pop it back on my ring mandrel and double check that we're nice and round, which we are. So the second way that we can add a stone to our ring bands is by setting that setting in the middle of our ring shank. So instead of setting it on top, we're going to put it inset. So I'm going to be using one of our 4mm tube settings, and we've got our ring. You want to make sure to either use a pre-made ring or make your ring fully and completely. So I've completely soldered this ring all the way around. And this is really the only way to ensure that your ring is perfectly round when you add that setting. If you tried to make your ring band and solder it to the setting in one go, it's very likely that you won't end up perfectly round, or you might end up not at the exact size that you want. So I already know this is going to be a size 7. It's a size 7 right now, so this really is my preferred method of doing it. So I've got my ring and I've got my setting, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out of my ring band the exact size of my setting. So you can do this in two ways. You can use a pair of calipers and measure your setting. So my setting is measuring at 4.57, and I can take that now and I can mark my ring band and cut out that exact amount. If you made the ring band yourself, you're going to want to cut out that seam that you used to form the ring. So just cut that seam right out so then you don't have to worry about reflowing it. So I'm just going to mark where those points match up on my ring so that I know I'm cutting out the right amount. If you don't have calipers, that's okay. You can use a pair of dividers, a ruler, basically anything to measure the size of your setting and translate it onto your ring band. So now that I've got that marked, it's always a good idea just to double check an eyeball with your setting just to make sure that you've marked it correctly. And you can use your snips or a saw to cut this little chunk out. Make sure to use the flat side of the snips up to your ring band to keep it flat, and you will want to come in with your file after you snip that little section out just to make sure that those are nice and flat. Going to file both of them. And now I'm going to fit my setting in here. I like to do it with a little bit of tension. So I'm just going to push my ring closed just a smidge and open it up and place it around my setting so that it is held there with tension. And so now we know that we're the right size, and I'm going to take a look at it just to make sure that the ends of my ring are filed at the correct angle so they match up with my bezel nice and perfectly. And I'm not going to worry too much about whether it's nice and perfectly aligned right now, because I'm going to do that when we set it up for soldering. I'm just making sure that everything fits and will solder up cleanly, which it does. So now we're going to set up for soldering. All right, so I've got my solder board over here, and the way that I like to do this is I do still like to hold my ring shank in the cross-locking tweezers, even though it's held onto the setting with tension, just to make sure that when we are soldering, the heat doesn't make anything tip over or anything like that. So I'm going to flux up all of my parts, and I am going to make sure to put my setting upside down on my solder board, which when you're using those tube settings, make sure to double check, because one side has a seat cut into it and one side does not. But sometimes it can be a little tricky to see which side is the seat. So just make sure to double check that beforehand and set it up upside down. And then I'm going to place my shank around that setting using that tension and make sure that it is nice and even and upright. And I want that shank sitting, the bottom of that shank, the bottom of that tube sitting as close to the edge of my ring shank as possible. And that's for minimal cleanup, but also to make sure that the bottom of our stone doesn't hit our finger. We don't want to take any height off of that bezel if we don't have to. And now you're going to come in, do all your double checks, make sure it's right, left, even, perfect, all that good stuff. All right. And I'm using that hard solder again. I'm going to use it for this whole solder job. I'm going to put one little ball of solder on each side where my shank touches that bezel and flow them at the same time. So I'll put a couple chips of solder out. Again, I'm always going to put a little bit more than I need. And we are going to come in and solder the same way we've done all the other ones. All right, so I have pulled my ring out of the pickle with my setting set in set. And the first thing I want to make sure to do is grind down the inside of my ring so that the setting is nice and smooth with the band. You can do that with a file, or I often like to use a rotary tool, a sanding barrel with my flex shaft, and just kind of grind that even. So I'm going to do that real quick. Alright, so I've ground down the inside of that bezel so that it's nice and smooth, and when I put that ring on, I don't feel it at all. It just slides right on. If you want to now, you can just kind of like double check that it sits evenly on your mandrel and is nice and round. And now we're going to set the stone. First you would finish, you would add whatever sort of finish you would want, whether that's high polish, satin finish, etc. You always want to finish your piece completely before stone setting. That's pretty much your last step. So I'm going to take my ring and I'm going to pop it on my mandrel for support. The mandrel is what is going to support my ring during that setting process. And there's two ways that you can tube set. The great thing about the settings from Halstead is that they come with the seat pre-cut. So you don't have to worry about cutting the seat. It's already perfectly cut so that when you plop your stone in there, you know it's going to be sitting nice and level at the perfect height with just the right amount of material folding over the edge. Super easy. So if you have a set of these tube setting punches, they are great and can make your setting go super quick and fast. They're just basically a little steel tool that has a cup that fits perfectly over your setting and will set it perfectly. If you don't have one of those, that's totally okay. You can use that same pusher that we used for our prong setting and a chasing hammer, and instead of hammering the tool over, you're just gonna hammer in opposites. So you're gonna work north, south, east, west, and just kind of hold that tool, give it a couple taps, opposite, and then work your way all the way around in a circle to set that. I prefer these little setting punches because they make everything go super quick and easy. So I'm gonna pop my stone into my setting first. Have your little wax stick on hand if you need to readjust. And I just want to take a look at it, and I can see that from one direction my stone looked nice and even, but from the other it's a little crooked. So I just want to make sure to fix that before I set. All right, we are sitting nice and level. My ring is pushed all the way up on my mandrel for support. I'm going to pop that little tool over and I'm going to give it one hit with my chasing hammer. You're just going to double check your stone didn't move. And then I like to give it one or two more taps just to make sure that that edge is pushed down all the way. And our stone is set. A good way to double check this is to grab your sticky wax and kind of try and pull your stone out. If it doesn't pull out, you know you've done a good job setting it. And I always like to take a polishing cloth or one of those rubber wheels like I talked about to highlight that bezel, just shine it up a little bit and make it really sparkle. And that's it. We've got 2 rings that we made with our settings, but like I said, this kit makes a total of 5 rings with settings on 4 of them and one kind of plain band for stacking. And it's a great introduction to some of these setting techniques as well as to ring making in general. If you are looking for some more advanced skills or to move your metalsmithing and jewelry making skills along, looking for in-person classes is a great option. I would Google your location and jewelry making classes or metalsmithing classes, and hopefully you'll get some great options. Thanks for joining me on All Things Rings today. Bye.